Bottle Man. We ran from Riley Wells because we thought he was a murderer. His rickshaw clinked up the road, rattling with Coca-Cola and Mountain Dew and knee-high bottles. They brought a nickel apiece at the store back then. Most folks thought he cared about that little bit of money, but we'd heard he liked to have a lot of nickels to put on dead kids' eyes to keep them closed. That story got started when the Anderson cousins drowned in a farm pond. Their bodies were found side by side on the sandy bank, eyes covered with 4 brand new nickels. Someone claimed they saw Riley on a nearby road. The sheriff questioned him, but all he came back with was the usual story that Riley was a harmless idiot. They couldn't even prove he got near the Anderson boys, though it was possible he'd tried to rescue them. Nobody could verify anything one way or the other. We knew better. We knew Riley did it. We knew a stone-cold killer from hell when we saw him. So that day in March when he came clinking close to the house instead of keeping to the road like usual, and worse, he turned up our driveway, we got scared so bad, none of us could have peed on a quilt. We were playing softball in the front yard, and I'll never forget that yard because the grass was centipede. When you ran barefoot, the blades cut the tender skin of your feet. Not much, but bad enough to make 'em itch so you couldn't sleep when you went to bed at night. Anyway, I was pitching, and my sister Ember, who was standing at the bare spot we used for home plate next to the front steps, dropped the bat and ran toward me. "We need to hide. Bottle Man's coming right up the driveway." She didn't point. She didn't need to. I recognized the sound of all that glass clinking and that squeaky right tire on Riley Wells' rickshaw. We gathered up our cousins who were visiting, and all of us hid behind the shrubbery with our collie, Tim. The living room window was open, and our older sister Logan was playing the piano, practicing for church that night. She had perfect touch, fingers striking perfect 6 and diminished chords, moving from etude to hymn, from Mozart to Fanny J. Crosby. Her fingers were like wind on a keyboard, constant, unerring, never missing. Behind the harmony of her hands came the discordant thrum of the Magnavox TV, where my father was listening to NFL highlights once again narrate the story of Bob Grease and Larry Sonka on their way to the first perfect season. You could also hear my mother's sewing machine jabbing stitches and Daddy yelling at her for messing up the reception. "Every darn time you turn that thing on, the screen fills up with snow." Mama yelled back, "Well, pretend they're playing in Pittsburgh." Pretty soon, Logan's delicate piano playing ramped up into banging to drown out all the fuss. So inside the house, it was just a run-of-the-mill Sunday. But outside, we hunkered shivering behind the Nandinas, afraid Riley Wells was going to catch us and kill us and put nickels on our eyes. What happened, though, was he just bypassed us, pulling his squealing, clinking rickshaw to the back of our property. Ember and me looked at each other, fit to be tied. Here we were expecting to be murdered, and all we got was ignored. We had to follow and find out why. First thing we did was tell the cousins to go inside the house so we could sneak up on Riley without them yakking and giving us away. We chased after him at a distance, juking left to the Chinaberry tree, right to the pump house, and back left to Mama's waist-high growth of irises. Our property line was bordered with a barbed wire fence that was strung tight across the top of a sharp bluff. It was about an 8-foot drop-off once you crawled under the fence. Just in front of the barbed wire was a stack of telephone poles and old glass insulators Daddy had bought when the power company had come through and replaced the lines. The insulators were clear glass and green glass. The March sun made them sparkle like diamonds and emeralds. Sometimes we pretended they were hand grenades and threw them when Daddy wasn't watching. Though he never sold any, they were said to be worth 50 cents each, and he would have whipped our behinds if we broke one. Riley Wells must have thought they were interesting, too. He set the rickshaw down and stared at the pile of glass like he'd found some kind of treasure. He looked at the western sky for a bit, and his face looked pained. He mouthed a word that looked like no and covered his ears. "Why's he acting like that?" Ember asked. "You know folks say he ain't right," I replied. "Maybe he's a murderer and an idiot." "Sure acting like it. Look at him." Leaning against one of the tall pines that watched like sentinels 4 deep on the top of the bluff, Riley dug his hand into the pocket of his faded jeans and pulled out some pieces of baling twine. After knotting them with a bunch of loops, he reached into his rickshaw and started taking out bottles. I saw a Dr. Pepper, 2 Cokes, a knee-high, and a Sundrop. He slipped the loops of twine around the necks of the bottles and pulled them tight. When he had all 5 strung up that way, he draped them over the low-hanging limb of a pine tree. Far as we could tell, they just hung there and looked stupid. But Riley looked pleased with himself. Things warmed up when he bent over Daddy's precious pile of insulators and started throwing them into his rickshaw. He took 8, just enough to replace the bottles he'd hung. Then he lifted up the handles on his rickshaw and started ambling back toward our driveway and the main road. "Now I know he's an idiot," Ember said. "I'm going to go get Daddy." You would have thought Daddy was Mercury Morris, the way he came blasting out of the screen door. Mom and Logan ran behind him. Guess they thought having an intruder on the property was way more exciting than sewing and piano playing and fusses about static on the TV. Daddy made Riley put back every one of the insulators, chased him all the way back to the main road, yelling, "What in hell's wrong with you, coming up in a man's yard like this? Don't you ever let me catch you here again?" Riley left slow and steady, plodding along down the road until the heat waves wrinkled up from the pavement behind him and melted the last sight of him. Nobody much noticed that he'd left his bottles hanging on the pine limb. Riley came back 3 days later, and when I think about it, it was pretty strange. Everything seemed to happen out of turn that day. First, I heard a strange ringing sound, looked out the window and saw the wind was jangling Riley's bottles together. The sky was orange with the sun going down, and a strange black thundercloud crawled across the orange, spitting lightning. What caught my eye straight off was Riley standing right there, where he was told not to be, right under those bottles he'd hung from the pine limb, pointing toward the storm, yelling, "I don't know what." But the noise sure brought Daddy running from the barn. When I headed for the back door, I called out to Ember to come watch the fight because I figured Daddy was going to chase Riley down and knock the slop out of him. Mama was in the kitchen making supper with Logan. We ran past them like they would always be there. The silence before the storm was what Logan would have called a full rest in her music, and it didn't last long. All of the birds settled in a fog over the scar of lawn Daddy had carved out of the pine barren. Blackbirds especially fluttered down from every tree, their song a percussive clack full of rusty squeaks and squeals that sounded just like the wheels on Riley's rickshaw. They parted around our bare feet as we ran, their oily wings brushing our ankles and the tops of our toes. Daddy's face was steaming red, and his fists were clenched at his sides like he was still trying to make up his mind if he wanted to punch Riley out. As for Riley, he'd climbed up on top of the pile of insulators. The wind was lashing, the bottles on the tree were blown sideways, crooning woo-oo as the gusts sang across the bottlenecks. When we reached them, Daddy was yelling above the wind and the squawking blackbirds. "You can't just barge onto somebody's property and act like a fool. What I ought to do is go in the house right now and call the sheriff." Riley acted like he didn't hear a word. Ragged jeans flapping on his bony legs, he stood on top of the pile of glass and pointed past the clucking, pinwheeling blackbirds, past our little garden and the clothesline, to the house where you could see Mom and Logan washing and peeling potatoes in the kitchen window. I ran behind Riley to get a better look at what he was pointing at, and his finger, long and crooked and shadowed against the orange sky, seemed to entwine with another whirling finger that started to slither down from the thundercloud. It looked like Riley's hand was reaching up to grab a giant black snake. All the birds stopped clucking and squealing. The funnel whipped toward them, and the whole flock exploded from the ground with one great wing beat, sailing for safer ground up north. Don't know if it was the birds flying off or Ember screaming like she did, but Daddy spun around, and about the time he did, the roof came off the house, and the shingles went spinning up in the air, chasing the blackbirds. "Holy God!" Daddy yelled. He took off running for the house, tore right through the fresh plants in the garden. Dust from the furrows sprayed back from the toes of his boots. Ember and I probably would have died just standing there watching, but Riley clambered off the heap of glass, grabbed her by the arm and me by the collar. His bones must have been thicker than the meat he had on him, because Ember kicked his shin hard as she could and didn't faze him. "Let me go! You ain't putting no nickels on my eyes," she screamed. Made no matter. Whether he was a ghost or the angel of death, he was too strong for both of us. He pushed us toward the barbed wire, the steep bluff. The wind helped him, shoving all 3 of us. His cracked fingers were hot on the back of my neck, like he was bleeding, wounding himself to help us. The bottles he'd hung in the pine stretched to the end of their tether, trembled against each other, and broke off at the bottom. The jagged bottlenecks flailed, circling, whistling, slashing. My eardrums started to hurt like my brains were going to explode outside of my head. Riley led us stumbling through the pine needles as the wind gouged and rolled them into balls like tumbleweeds. 100 feet high above us, you could hear the pine tops snap and sizzle away in the gusts. Riley shoved us down so we wouldn't get our heads cut off. Big limbs started to fall, made the ground shake your heart when they'd thud and stick up like a spear right beside you. With hardly any strain, Riley finished shoving me and Ember under the barbed wire. We rolled down the bluff and wound up hugging each other's arms and legs at the bottom. The rickshaw flew over the fence and almost beat us to death, raining bottles as it flew over, spinning. Hailstones hit us all over and spat sand in my eyes, but I wiped them clean long enough to see Riley backed against the barbed wire, like he was trying to hold it in place. A golden arc of lightning near blinded me, but I saw it jump, sparking from the pine tops to the wire. The wind broke the fence posts, and the barbed wire curled around the trunks of the broken pines like silver tinsel. Riley was gone. Ember calls me late some nights. Doesn't have to be March. She'll call and ask, "Why us?" "I don't know, sweetie," I reply. She's asking the one reverent question of any survivor, and I'm giving the one respectful answer. Ember talks about the blackbirds, the way the insulation from our house hung all over the trees like pink Spanish moss, how the only smell was the smell of the broken pine trees. She names everything the tornado killed, damaged, or spared. "They found Mama, Daddy, and Logan. How come they never found Riley?" she asks. I don't like to think about it much. We lost our parents and our sister when the chimney collapsed. At least Daddy got them to the best shelter the house had to offer. As for Riley, they found the rickshaw 80 yards downwind of the bluff. I always tell Ember that after he saved us, Riley got blown around some, stood up, and walked away. But I don't believe that. I think the wind took him back to heaven where he came from. Maybe he's the angel of storms and comes back to help sometimes. I don't know.